right, welcome back. Week 7, modern life. So, in the last couple decades of the 19th century, we're moving into what is commonly referred to as the modern world. If you couldn't tell from the title of the slide. And this time is when we're transitioning from the 1800s to the 1900s. And some of the most prominent characteristics of this time are the speeding up of technological and scientific progress. So developments and inventions and discoveries are happening much more quickly than ever before in history. So not only is everything moving really quickly, but in comparison to how slowly things happened for the last, hundreds of years, this is like just unheard of. And it's kind of for everyone there, it's probably like a very magical time with how things are moving forward. But we're also seeing consequences of that rapid motion. So consequences associated with the increasing amount of people who are moving into urban areas for jobs. And when we talk about that, you have to think about if you have this, all the jobs are in the cities that have to do with, technology and sort of industrialization is the word I was looking for there. And so if you have this influx of people coming in, you have to think about where they're going to live, how you're going to keep up with sanitation, what are the working conditions going to be like, and that's all things that like urban developers have to keep up with, and they're not necessarily prepared to handle that. So we're going to see consequences of that. Additionally, we start to see patterns in life and labor that are the cause of mass manufacturing. And of course, with all of this, we're setting the stage to talk about how photography begins to change as well. So this notion of change and society's ability to affect change became a visible part of modern life, and photography played a major role in that. Photographs started to become essential in things like statistical reports. When folks would put together their sort of arguments toward urban improvement in the cities, they would use photographs for that. That's something that wasn't available to be used before. And the photographs also helped to produce visual archives, not only of the terrible living conditions that were a result of this influx of people, but also we could finally document photographically the likeness of criminals. So this is the first time that if you got arrested, they could take your picture, or perhaps your picture was taken and then you committed a crime. They could put that out there to try to find you. This is when that starts to happen. In addition, photography was not just being used as evidence anymore. It was not only being used to verify the truth, right? And what you could see, but it was also evolving in a way that allowed us to prove what the eye could not see. And that's really important. That statement there is going to come back with us when we start talking about movement photography later. But that statement there, that it was not only used to verify what could be seen, but also to prove what our eyes could not see, is another sort of magical development in photography around this time. So in Europe and the United States, you have photographs that are able to record physical movements that are too fast for the human eye to see. And then, of course, the X-rays discovered around this as well. And that's just completely mind-blowing, because you're looking inside of the body, and obviously an X-ray is a type of photograph. So today we're going to start off with talking about photography's role in the social reform at the turn of the century. Then we'll go on talking about the photography of movement and the sort of different devices that led up to the photography of movement. So social reform photography. We talked a little bit about women in the suffragist movement last week when I shared the material about women and the pictorialist movement. And the the suffragist movement was a social reform movement in itself, but the British suffragettes were making a point to use photography to help their cause, right? Suffragists were using photography to show images to the world that not only documented their rallies and their protests and things like what you see here, but they were also documenting their causes, right? So what did they stand for? And mainly what the women stood for was the poor. And so these photographs were sort of supporting their argument that giving the vote to women would draw more attention to this issue of poverty and how everyone could come together to help with this. Once others kind of realized the potential that photography held to actually show the truth to society, to the world, different reform organizations and privately run charities that did social work among the poor started to use photography to promote their work as well. So this is very similar to how things have kind of been evolving, right? You had, for example, the medical field. You had a few doctors using photography to record their work and their research, and they were trying to convince other doctors that this was a good tool to use. And then, of course, once everyone catches on, then they're like, oh yeah, like we have to use this. This is now instrumental to our archives, our records, our research, and sharing that visual element of it. And that's exactly what happened here with the suffragettes as well. So they sort of were able to be kind of a catalyst for using photographs for social reform. And there's two things that kind of happened with this increased visibility that photographs provided. The first is that with so many repeating images of the poor in their terrible living and working conditions, the public started to compartmentalize the poor as inferior. Like they'd always like sort of thought that, but now that they could see it, they're like visually able to kind of compartmentalize that. And so that's sort of related to when we're talking about early ethnographic photography and how that was kind of the catalyst for driving racism. And a similar thing for classism is happening now when you're having all these photographs of the poor. So the second thing is something that we now call compassion fatigue, which is certainly something that we still have today. But it means that as photographic coverage of events like war and social reform increased, the public response kind of decreased. Essentially, the novelty of photography was beginning to decline. Not dramatically yet, but people were becoming desensitized to the images that were once so incredibly sensational to the masses. And we can kind of think about that today in the way that there are so many images around us all the time, whether it's on our mobile devices or on billboards or television. Like images are everywhere, but we don't stop and look in awe at these images or even advertisements in the same way that folks once did. So we sort of have this compassion fatigue, or like this fatigue in general about looking at images. In a similar vein, like if you think about violence in video games, that's something that, you know, not just video games, I guess, movies and television too, it doesn't bother us in the way that it used to. Like the restrictions for what can be shown on television, Netflix, like feature films, like all of those restrictions that were once there to kind of protect people from being shocked have essentially been lifted. And so once everyone kind of got over the shock, now it's like nothing shocks us anymore. So you can kind of see the trend of that from, you know, the early days of photography and how it evolved until now. So the first guy I want to talk about today is Jacob Riis. This is a portrait of him. He's a Danish journalist living and working in New York. And when he first moved to the United States, he had a really hard time finding work because in the 1870s there was a depression happening in the US. And so it was really, I mean, it's difficult for anyone to find a job, probably even more difficult for someone immigrating from another country. Eventually, he finds a job as a police reporter, and he starts writing about these slums that he's encountering. And then he goes on to kind of use photography to bring a visual element to that, to illustrate what he's saying in his writing. Kind of similar to what you guys do in the journals, right? You're writing about a topic, but then you're also illustrating it with an image that corresponds. So at first he was using photographs that he would commission from other photographers, but you know that can get a little expensive to have to keep paying someone else to do this part of the job. So he taught himself how to do photography and started taking his own photos. So he would start taking the camera with him when he would go out into the streets at night. Now, luckily for him, flash photography had just been invented, and he actually became one of the very first photographers to use flash photography, which would be necessary if he's going out at night, right? Because even though the shutter speeds and the technical aspects of the cameras are continuously evolving, they're still not good enough to get a photograph at night unless you leave that shutter open for a really long time. So he used the flash to capture photographs inside buildings. Oh, sorry, I meant to change the slide. Here's one of his photographs. He used the flash to photograph inside buildings and also you know, outdoor night scenes, like this one is kind of in an alleyway here. And the types of images that he was creating were sort of he was trying to show the public what they didn't see, because most folks who lived, you know, in the upper class or even the upper middle class never went to these areas. And so they didn't really know from a visual standpoint what it looked like or what these people were living like in these spaces. So some of the images you'll see from Jacob Riis are, you know, crowded tenements, and tenements are basically tiny apartment buildings, like little pockets in these apartments. And he would photograph the slums, which were considered dangerous at that time, and scenes, all photographs of like what they would call the underclass. And most of the folks who would read his writing had only ever read about it if they had read about it at all. So bringing the photographs in was just a huge moment for this. And the images were published in different newspapers and magazines. There's an article that was called Flashes from the Slums, Pictures Taken in Dark Places by the Lightning Process. And the lightning process is what they originally called the flash photography, the lightning process. And this article described Jacob Riis and his team. He had a group of photographers that went around with him who were doing research in the slums using this new flash photography. The group themselves can be considered slightly controversial, since they would go around at night using their flash photography to, like, you know, illuminate the darkness and surprise their subjects. And sometimes they weren't very subtle about it. They would just barge into these tenements and set up their camera really quickly and flash it off and take a picture. So a lot of these, everyone in the images looks pretty authentic because they're not expecting these people to barge in and take these photographs. And I have a little video to show you this, but just to give you a little context about how this flash works. So the original flash, they would use gunpowder. And so they would actually use a device that looked like a gun, and it would pull the trigger and the flash would go off. So you can imagine being in one of these tenements and someone just like kicking the door open, setting up a camera, shooting off a gun with a bright light. Like, how terrifying and intrusive that would be for you. And the image on your screen right now, this one is one of his most famously used images. Like, this one has the the most recognition, I think, because it's used a lot in history textbooks and documentaries and things like that. But if you really look at this, you can see that there's like about, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's at least 8 people in here. And there, Jacob Riis is taking this photograph from the doorway. So this is the room. Like, that's it. And they're all crammed in there together. And it's just like, this is what he's trying to show the rest of the world, like the world that has the influence on the social reform movements to sort of help make these living conditions better for people. So he would also give these very dramatic lectures, like public lectures. So all the upper class people would, because they have so much money, they don't really need to work. They can attend all of these lectures like in their leisure time to learn about things. And so he would use the magic lantern that we talked about, and he would put his pictures on slides, and that way this whole group of people could see them. And again, these lectures were mostly given to middle class, upper class audiences in New York who had very little direct experience with the slums. And honestly, it's just because they're too afraid to go there, and like, why would they need to go there? And then of course he made the lectures like quite performative as well too. He would have pauses in them where they would sing hymns, and often when he showed the last slide, he would show an image of Jesus. And so he's making it almost into this like church service or prayer circle, if you will. In 1890, Riis published a book called How the Other Half Lives, and that's the title of this image here. And, at this time, the photographs of the poor and the conditions in which they're living is still like quite novel and engaging to the public. Like, people want to consume this information. They want to read it. It's very similar to the London Poor book that we looked at, except this one was obviously more current. So Riis's photographs have really come to stand for late 19th century, early 20th century social reform. They became credible because of the way that he composed them. They resembled the spontaneous look of these newly introduced snapshots that we talked about last week. But he, like many others before him, also staged and posed some of his images to get the drama he was going for, especially the ones that he took with children. And that's what's on the screen now. You have these 3 children here, and he's taken their shoes off and kind of posed them in the gutter like this, which, again, like, you can decide how you feel about staging and posing images. I think sometimes when it's for propaganda to help people, it's probably okay, as long as there's like a semblance of truth embedded there, which I think in his images there are. He wasn't asking for like government intervention when he's trying to like share his ideas for reform. What he was hoping for is that if he showed these slides to the wealthy, that he could convince them to consider tenement construction as a work of charity. And then private investors would take less profit when building the tenements, and then they could provide these better lodgings for people. So usually I ask a question for discussion at this point, what do you think about the fact that he intruded so much into the lives of the poor? And how do you think that this affects how the images can be read? And that's something important to consider. So please think about that, because Riis's photographs have been the subject of debate, both because of how much he intruded on the lives of the poor and because of the interpretations of how I guess I should say, and because of how the images were interpreted since his death. And there's 2 things I mean about that. There's questions that come up about his lack of sympathy with his subjects, and about how museums have reinterpreted his images. So instead of including instead of having a show about social reform photography and addressing like all of the problematics that come along with that, usually his photographs will simply be lumped in with American art. And so if you see these in a museum, there's likely going to be no real context about what you're looking at. And this is a problematic with museums taking his work out of context. So there's just a lot of layers to this here. So now I'm going to show you the video that just kind of gives you a little preview of how he was doing his process. So let me get to the share screen here. Okay. All right. Here we go.
Slums are growing uncontrollably. Multiple families crammed into one small tenement room. Human waste pours into the streets, alleys, and open courtyards.
People were crowded in. There were windowless tenements. Sometimes you had no internal plumbing, just privies in the basement, in the backyard. And the Lower East Side during these years was the single most crowded place in the entire world.
Jacob Riis, Danish immigrant, crime reporter, photographer. He gets leads, the stories from Chief Inspector Burns. Now he's about to expose the hell of tenements. Jacob Riis knows what it's like to be poor. 15 years ago, he lost his job in a stock market crash. It's midnight, but Riis has a new technology that will change the public perception of poverty. An explosive powder that produces enough light to photograph in the dark. This is one of the first ever photographs of slum life. It shocks millions.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jacob A. Riis, and this is how the other half live and die in New York City.
Magazines refuse to print his work, so Riis puts on his own magic lantern shows. His mission, to show America's wealthy something they've never seen before. Filth and desperation on their doorstep.
In this block, 9 dead were carried out this year alone. 5 baby coffins.
What he demonstrated was that there is another reality, that all that prosperity didn't trickle down all the way to the bottom, and there were some deplorable living conditions, and this country was not just forced to confront those conditions, but then was moved to begin to deal with them.
Riis publishes his pictures in a book called How the Other Half Lives. It will sell more than 28 million copies worldwide. Within 2 decades, the worst of the New York slums are torn down. Tenements sell at auction for as little as $1. Riis's campaigning forces all New York schools to build playgrounds and landlords to install toilets inside apartments, not outside. It is the first step in tackling the slums.
Okay, so now obviously that's not like a real video recording of Jacob Riis and his crew. It's a reenactment, but it does give you a really good idea of what that looked like at that time. And you saw the gun flash that they had, and you saw him giving the lectures, and he was really working towards this social reform that was so needed at this time. Again, decide what your opinion is about his sort of intrusive behavior, because that is still problematic despite, his good intentions. And that's what we always have to contend with in some of these situations, is kind of weighing what is, okay in the name of reform. So the next gentleman I want to talk about is Louis Hine. He's another social reform photographer, and originally he taught at New York's Ethical Culture School, which was considered a very progressive institution for the time. The school actually asked him to learn photography so that he could teach the class as part of the school's curriculum. And Hine is he's very famous for a lot of his series, so I don't want to say most famous, but his first series that he did was these portraits at Ellis Island of all the immigrants arriving, and then they would move into some of the poorer neighborhoods in the area. So he would take his students to Ellis Island with him, and they would make photographs there. Well, I think the students would watch him make the photographs and then learn from it. But he told them that this was important so that they can have the same, and this is a direct quote, have the same regard for contemporary immigrants as they have for the pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock. Immigration's always been an issue in the United States, right? We see that today in our news every day, right? And so even back then, it was important to remind these students that they came from immigrants, and the immigrants that are coming now are no different than those that had come before. Taking photographs at Ellis Island was so not easy. There are thousands and thousands of people crowded in this space, getting off boats, getting off the island, getting on boats. Like, it was just nutty. And so you can imagine with the equipment that you have, his equipment would have been very similar to what we saw Jacob Riis have in that video. You can imagine that with all that equipment you have to set up, it's going to be really difficult to take photographs. So he really had to adapt to how quickly things moved and make decisions kind of on the spot. He did have one of the newer cameras that was made available. That's called a Graflex camera. It was a little bit more portable than some of the others, and the detail and the framing was more precise than anything that had come before. But the usual way of making the photographs was still kind of complicated. He would first have to choose who he wanted to photograph, right? He had to pick his subject from all of these people and then communicate with them in a way that they could understand, because not everyone spoke English. So he would have to sort of convince these total strangers who are, not only stranger to him, but stranger to this new world that they're in, to sit and pose for him to make a photograph. And he was also using flash photography. He was using a more evolved version of it, which was called a flash pan. So this one looked less like a gun. It was like the shape of a T, and there was a little tray on it, and you would pour the gunpowder in there and light it on fire, as opposed to pulling a trigger. But he really he had one shot because he couldn't keep these people for more than one try. So the fact that his images turned out as stunning and beautiful as they did is just kind of incredible. So he would take his photograph and then he'd move on to the next subject, and then he would caption and write a little note about who he was photographing. I'm going to try to find the bigger version of this so I can actually read to you what's on there, because I can't see it because I need glasses and I'm in denial. So the image on the left is number 12, an Albanian woman from Italy at Ellis Island, 1905. This woman is wearing her native costume. At times, the island looked like a costume ball with the multicolored, many-style national costumes. And then, of course, he says picture study by Louis W. Hine. And the one on the right is a group of German, group of German immigrants at Ellis Island, 1926. So you can see the one on the left is from 1905. The one on the right is from 1926. He was doing this for 20 years. So this one on the right says, this is a typical German sampling of farmers, scholars, professional men, and perhaps a butcher. He's not sure. The group is fairly prosperous, as modern clothes and baggage indicate. So he would always write this little note to make sure that he was acknowledging their humanness, right? He's not just taking a photograph of them and saying, okay, here's a person from this country, like here's a little description to tell you something about them. And if he could communicate with them, he would, and if he couldn't, then, you know, then of course he wouldn't. But it's important to acknowledge his use of text with the image. It's always, it brings something else to it. You know, we've seen a couple examples of text and image combined, and again, it's an early example of what we now call documentary photography, but it brings more to the story. You're not just allowed to bring your own perspective to it. This image is probably one of Hine's most famous images, like solo images. This one's documenting child labor. And so when Hine was working at the Ethical Culture School, he started freelancing for what was called the National Child Labor Committee. And that committee was attempting to reform child labor by urging legislation to control this industrial hiring practices. What was happening at this time and before is that child labor was always a thing, right? But it was never addressed. It was just something that happened and everyone looked the other way. But now when you have these huge factories and mills and canneries and mines, they would employ children because they were tiny and they could get in, you know, to the machines, but they also didn't have to pay them as much. So they could get all this labor for very little cost. And Hine traveled around the U.S. between 1907 and 1918. So he was doing this simultaneously with his work at Ellis Island. And he took about 5,000 photographs of child labor. And sometimes he would have to like sort of put on a disguise to gain access to photograph the children in the factories and the mines and the canneries and the mills, because if he went in there saying that he was photographing for the National Child Labor Committee, like they wouldn't let him in, because none of the people who own these factories want to be shut down, and they don't want this legislation to come into play, because then they would have to actually pay adults full wage to do the work that they can pay children peanuts to do. So while Hine is working for the National Child Labor Committee, he's also kind of working with welfare organizations. He creates what he calls the photo story. And a photo story, according to Hine, was this narrative composed of pictures and words that would be published in journals and magazines. And the way that he approached it was in this non-linear way, which means like if you're you know, if you think about children's books, there's many children's books that don't have words, they just have pictures, but the pictures are telling a story in an order. So if you looked at the pages in the book out of order, you wouldn't get the story. What Hines is doing is he is making a photo story that can be looked at in any order. So there's no like linear narrative to this. It's all like you can look at them in a room in whatever order you want. You're going to understand child labor in this way. I have a video about Hine that I'm going to show you, but I want to talk about this other work that he did first. So after his work with the immigrants at Ellis Island and the Child Labor Committee, he goes on to publish this book called Men at Work, Photographic Study of Men and Machines. And basically what this is doing is he's documenting the labor and construction going into the Empire State Building. So he's photographing the workers in all of these like pretty precarious positions while they're building this steel framework and this structure. And a lot of times he had to take risks just like these men. There was one time that they actually put him in a basket tied to a string and swung him off the edge of the building. He's like about 1,000 feet up at this point, so that he could capture some of these photographs. So at this time, there weren't safety nets in the way there are today when things are being built. That you, as a person, had to go out and risk your life every moment of every day to construct these buildings. And what Hine is up to here is he's focusing on the dignity of the working class. the work portraits that he has, like those in Men at Work, among others, really put the laborers at the center of the picture. He is celebrating their skill, their perseverance. And although he addressed the workers as his audience, most of his photographs did appear in journals that were read by professional and volunteer social reformers. So, he was trying to really put them out there and let them know, like, these people are building your buildings, and they are very skilled, and they are very important, and they have a lot of dignity and worth. And so he brings that thread throughout all of his pieces. You can see it in the immigrant photos, you can see it in his child labor photos, and then finally in his Men at Work photos. So let's look at the video about Hein. Again, some of it might be slightly repetitive from what I've already shared with you, but as I've said before, sometimes it's good to hear things repeated, and sometimes videos are easier for folks than looking at the pictures or listening to my voice. So I'm going to pull that one up here, and we will watch this one.
At the time that Louis Hein began photographing for the National Child Labor Committee, most people did not believe that child labor existed or was a problem. And so his first effort was to literally assemble evidence. The cotton mill photographs are perhaps the best known of Hein's pictures. They're extremely moving, partly because the children are just so little. The machines are so big. The children working in coal mines were 7 and 8 years old, and they worked in the dark. The newsies were the newsboys and occasionally newsgirls who sold newspapers on the street at all hours of the day or night. The newsies, of course, were also exploited child laborers. It was Hein's photograph, as much as any written word, that persuaded legislators to change the law. This book is an effort to reconsider Louis Hein, who is well known in the United States, but not so well known outside of this country. He is called the father of the documentary movement, although his work begins long before documentary is defined as a medium. He saw himself as someone who was contributing to social change. He started with photographing immigrants. The Ellis Island photographs were his first serious photographic project, and what strikes me about them is the direct human connection between the photographer and his subjects. Louis Hein was a formal little man. He always wore a suit and tie. I imagine him in the chaos of Ellis Island, picking out someone and probably without a common language, persuading them to stop, to stand still for a photograph. Hein's mission was to put a human face on what most people saw as a kind of broad brush immigrant problem. I think that labor is his core subject from the beginning. He starts by looking at labor that is bad for people, and that's child labor. But he moves into a discussion of labor as a wonderful thing. Laborers are his heroes, and you need only look at the Empire State Building photographs to see that. He's photographing these ordinary people, riveters and welders going about their business in a way that makes them heroic. It was a tremendously aspirational building, and so to underscore the power and importance of this building and the men who built it was almost a defiant response to the Depression. I think he teaches us that photographs can be simultaneously factual and emotional, and that we shouldn't be separating those pieces. He never stopped caring about the people he photographed. I think that's pretty important.
So just a nice little summary with visuals and of course a little voiceover of what I just went over. His work was so important, and it really, between him and Rees, like they really charged full steam ahead with some of these social reform issues that were so important. So that tidies that up. I would like to move on to science and photography, the photography of movement. This is probably one of many of my favorite topics in early photography. So hopefully this will be, I feel like this part will be fun to alleviate some of the depressing aspects of social reform issues. So this is a picture of Edward Muybridge. You read about him briefly in the text when back when we were discussing the different photographers. Well, I guess we didn't talk about them, but the textbook talks about the different photographers who were photographing out in Yosemite. That's not what he's most known for. So if he comes up in a quiz, which he may, don't talk about Yosemite and his photographs, because that's not what I'm asking about. I'll likely be asking about his movement studies. So the big thing about Muybridge is that there's this question that's plaguing him, and it's a question that's been around for a long time, and painters have been asking this question for hundreds of years. And the question is, do all four legs of the horse leave the ground when the horse moves quickly, like when it runs really fast? And the reason this is a question is because in most paintings and drawings of horses historically, they're going to look something like this. When the horse is galloping in an image, the painters or drawers would draw them so that the legs were stretched out in front and behind, and all four hooves are off the ground. So this horse is like floating here, right? Now, we know, or hopefully we know, that if a horse has its front legs out in front of it and its back legs out behind it at the same time, it's going to fall on its big belly. It's too big of an animal for that to make sense. So Muybridge wanted to sort of prove this theory. He wanted to prove that all four hooves of the horse came off the ground at some point during their gallop. So he sets up this raceway, and he draws lines at 21-inch intervals, and he sets up cameras at each interval. And as they release the horse trips the threads that then release the shutter on the cameras. And he has 12 cameras set up. And so all these cameras, each one gets tripped as the horse runs by. And this is one of the results of his experiment, right? If we look, he gets like one of, there's 12 images here. So each camera's provided us with an image of the horse running by. If we look more closely at the second frame, this is the second frame, we can see that the horse does indeed pick up all four legs from the ground, but they are tucked underneath its body as opposed to stretched out as was previously thought. This is a big thing because, like, if you even just Google old paintings of horses, you're gonna see some funky things on how painters have kind of shown them running. And it really wasn't until Muybridge did this study that it was known how the horse actually moves. So again, this is a time when we're seeing the camera's showing us things that the eye cannot see, because it's just too fast for our eyes to register. So this discovery was published in a science journal that was called Nature in 1878. And there's this French physiologist, Etienne Jules Mouret, and this is him here, another big white bearded white man. So he stumbles across Muybridge's studies in this journal. And Mouret had been studying human and animal locomotion for over 10 years, and he was very inspired by Muybridge's photographs to take up this medium for himself, the medium of photography. And so Mouret invented a camera that looked like a gun. He actually built it from the foundation of a gun, and this allowed him to make exposures rapidly enough that he could actually take photographs of a bird flying, which was so cool for this time. His other camera had a rotating disc, and it had all these small slots cut into it so that if he spun it in front of the open lens on the camera and a person walked in front of it or did a pole vault like this image here, the person would be in a different position on one sheet of film, one piece of paper, each time the disc went past the open camera. So the result of this is obviously showing human movement in time and space. And Murray would call this work chronophotography, which is essentially time photography. Murray's images are all like really beautiful, but he wasn't interested in their aesthetics, right? He was more interested in the way that they were able to kind of isolate these phases of movement that our eyes couldn't see. So in this one, you can see the gesture of the figure sort of leaping over the woman standing below. I think it's a woman. Maybe it's just like a little prop, but it looks like a woman. He was constantly trying to improve on his photographic devices so that he could get rid of any overlapping of the moving figures. He was really shooting for he wanted to just see the motion. He didn't want to see any distractions. So something like this would have been something he was going for. He also created a camera that allowed the film to move with each exposure as well, which was brand new. You don't get that until much later. We're going to keep talking about movement photography, but I always like to bring up this topic of futurism. There's two images here, and we'll talk more in depth about futurism in a minute, but we have to kind of circle back. But the reason I bring it up now is because in these two images here, the one on the left is a drawing by Paul Riker, and the second is something a little more famous you may have seen before, Nude Descending a Staircase, #2 by Marcel Duchamp. And both of these, the drawing and the painting, both look a lot like those movement photographs that Murray was making, right? So you can kind of see now how drawings and paintings are being influenced by photography. Whereas before, in many situations, it was photography that was being influenced by paintings. But these paintings we know are influenced by photography, and specifically movement photography, because what we're seeing here isn't something that our eyes ever see. So for a painter to come up with this, either they have the most incredible imagination for this time, or they're being inspired by what they're seeing in the movement photography. So again, we'll touch on this a little more later, but I always like to bring it up just because it looks so much like what Murray is doing in his photographs. So back to Muybridge. Muybridge starts to gain a lot of notoriety for his movement studies, and he starts to become this sort of science celebrity, which is sort of cool. And then the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia invites him to come and basically be he's not really considered an artist, but we would say he's an artist or scientist in residence there, so that they would put him up, they would give him money, and he would continue to work on his experiments. While he's there, he meets this American realist painter, Thomas Eakins, who's in this photograph here. And Eakins was really just an amateur photographer, but he would use Muybridge's photographs when he would teach his classes about painting and drawing, so that he could show his students how humans and animals actually moved, and they didn't have to sort of think about it in their head, right? They could use a photographic reference, very similar to when we were talking about the academies, right? Where painters would have photographs made so they didn't have to use live models anymore. Now they could use the photograph. The same thing's happening with the movement of animals and humans. So Eakins didn't photograph for a very long time. He did dabble in making, images that were very similar to the ones that Muybridge and Murray were making. But he was truly a painter at heart. You can see his are a little bit more amateur than some of the others. And then there's also research to show that Eakins sometimes would take the images and put them on slides, and then he would project them onto his canvas, and he could outline and trace the forms from these photographs, which, you know, is not that dissimilar from the camera obscura when they would use that as a tool. It's just now you have the magic lantern, which makes it a little easier. You don't have to build your camera obscura room to get the reflection that you want. And here's another one of his. So I do want to look a little bit further at Muybridge's work that he did while he was in Philadelphia. So while he's there, he was really focused on refining his techniques. He created over 100,000 images of movement, right? I have like these catalogs of all of his photographs, and like I always pass them around the room when we're doing this class in person, and I'm so sorry you won't be able to get to see them all. But honestly, if you Google him, like there's so much there. You'll see he did so much work. But he would make photographs of male and female nudes. Some of them, like this one, they're wrestling. This one, she's just doing something as mundane as carrying a towel down the stairs, and he has 3 different perspectives, you know, front, back, and side. Here we have a man speed walking, and he again has both perspectives. You can also see that in every single one of his studies, there's a grid behind the person. So that's important. We've been talking about the grid. So that seems it's starting to resurface in some of these studies that are being considered scientific, right? If you're going to study movement or locomotion, then you need to also have some sort of grid reference there. After he exhausts his studies of humans, he moves on to animals. And here is the cat, and you can see the grid in that one. And then we have an ostrich. They had a zoo at the university, so he had access to all these like exotic animals to work with. Here we have a bird in flight. This one is a really good view of the grid. And then we have this donkey doing its famous kick. So he ended up creating this 8-volume publication called Animal Locomotion in 1887. And now they're able to make books larger, so they've condensed them into single volumes with everything in it. But these chronophotographs, these time photographs influenced art, mostly painters who, with that very initial galloping horse photograph, started to paint horses according to the truth of their movement captured by Muybridge rather than how your eye would kind of perceive the movement of the animal. So to emphasize my point of the significance of Muybridge and Marais and everyone's work here, painters recognized how the human brain kind of confirms the truth of optical realism, and that led to this greater discussion about the role of human perception in modern art in general. So it really like evolved the way that things are thought of in this world. So I want to go back to photography and futurism. Futurism was this artistic and social movement that originated in Italy in the early 20th century, and it emphasized things like speed, technology, youth, violence, and also objects like the car, the airplane, and the industrial city. So you can see from the terms that I just used and the objects that I just described, they kind of relate back to like things that move, things that are fast. And the futurists were very intrigued by the visual language of the stop action photographs that we kind of just looked at, like Muybridge, Marais, sometimes Eakins. And then we have Giacomo Bella, who interpreted photographs of movements in this painting here. I think this painting is quite funny. It's called The Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash. And you can see that he's using what he's seen in photographs to inform how he's rendering movement in his paintings. So again, the photograph is informing the stylistic, aesthetic approach to the painting. You can see the dog walker's feet. There's many, many feet there overlapping, and the dog's leash is twirling around, and the dog's ears are flapping, his tail is wagging, his feet are running fast and even faster than the dog walker because his legs are so tiny. So you can see and feel the movement in this type of painting. After Bella made this painting, this photographer, Antonio Bragaglia, who actually pioneered what is called futurist photodynamism, a method of photography that's focused on capturing energy and feeling of the movement, took a photograph in this style of Bella and his painting. So now we're getting super meta here. There's a photograph taken, likely by Bella, and he uses that photograph to make this painting, and then Bragaglia comes along and makes a photograph of Bella with his painting in that same dynamic style. So we're just like getting so mediated here, but I just love it. It's so fascinating, like the lengths that they're going to emphasize this photodynamism and the futurist way of working. Bragaglia would always make a point to accentuate the blur of motion that, you know, most action photographers would see as kind of a fault in their images, and they would try to remove them or avoid them, right? Like up until now, we've been talking about how the technical side of photography is trying to get everything sharp and crisp and capture movement and make the shutter speed so fast that you don't have to like sit forever for your portrait. And these futurists are just like, no, let's just embrace the movement. And Bragaglia thought that his multiple exposures would kind of help revolutionize photography by purifying, ennobling, and truly elevating it to art. And that sounds a whole lot like Hughes's definition of high art photography. It is actually his direct definition of high art photography. So you can see Bragaglia is also using this method to elevate photography to an art form. Unlike other photographers at the time who tried to elevate photography by making their pictures carry, you know, these moral lessons, or by recreating paintings, by staging actors to kind of reflect these old masterworks, Bragaglia really believed that the photographic artist should render the world's invisible vital energy. And that's kind of what you're seeing in these images, right? You're seeing this invisible energy that we don't see with our eyes. The camera is the only thing that can capture this. And Bragaglia was, you know, the studies that we looked at that Murray and Muybridge did, they're pretty clear, right? And they have a very specific scientific outcome. What Bragaglia and other futurist photographers were after was something more spiritual. They didn't want to do like necessarily a scientific study. They wanted it to be about the feeling and the energy that you're experiencing when you're seeing this cellist play the instrument, and you can see the lines of their arms and their bow and their fingers on the frets. The photodynamic photograph, with its sort of obscure and blurry areas, allowed him to essentially record reality unrealistically. And there's just something so dreamy and curious and sometimes spooky about these images. I mean, this one in particular, this guy is moving his head and leaning down throughout the exposure. It's just sort of like he's removing a mask or something, but then there's like the trace of it there too. It's incredible. So I get excited about those. Next, on a related note, we're going to talk about photography and the invention of moving pictures. Now, I don't really mean motion pictures like movies as we understand them today, but rather moving pictures, pictures that move. Very simply, what was being experimented with before movies became a thing. And so there's all these different devices, which at the time they called them philosophical toys, but they would allow you, they were handmade things sometimes, and sometimes some of them got like mass produced if they saw like a market for that. But they let people kind of play around with and see pictures in motion. So the phenakistoscope, the zoetrope, the praxinoscope, and the kinetoscope are the ones that we're going to kind of go through first. So the first one is the phenakistoscope. That's a mouthful. And here's a really early version of it that has one wheel, the wheel on the right has the illustrations on it, and the wheel on the left has like little slits in it. And there's another version of it here where it's just one disc and it has slits in the center circle and the illustrations on the outer circle. So this one you would hold up to a mirror and spin it, and then you would see through the slots moving, you would see the horse running. I have some animations to share so that you can kind of visualize how this would work. So let me get to our share screen here. Okay, so here, like this is just a fun one. There's all these folks that have turned many of these phenakistoscopes into these wonderful animations. So this would give you an idea of how that would work. And then I also have a video that I'm going to show you on how to make one, because I think that it also really helps you to understand, like, it's hard to see from the pictures, you know, like normally in class I'll have an example and I'll pass it around, but I don't have that right now. So here is a video that shows you how to make it. Also something like fun to do in lockdown if you need a project to do. Could be fun to play around with. So I'll let you see how this is made, and then hopefully you can kind of, between the pictures I've shown you and this video, understand how this particular one works.
How to create a phenakistoscope. The phenakistoscope is a predecessor of the flip book, but don't worry, it's easier to make than pronounce. You will need a piece of stiff paper, approximately 8 to 12 inches on a side, such as a manila folder, drawing paper, a drawing compass, a protractor, a pencil, a thumbtack, a ruler, scissors, rubber cement, and a wall mirror. Step 1. Plan out your animation with sketches. There should be 8 to 12 steps, each representing a frame. The best animations for a phenakistoscope are cyclical, like a horse galloping or a child jumping rope. Step 2. Anchor your compass point in the center of the stiff paper and draw a circle that just touches the edges. Leave a small mark where the compass is anchored. If you're using a manila folder, cut it along the crease and use half of it as the stiff paper. Step 3. Use the ruler to draw a faint line that bisects the circle. Step 4. Use the protractor to divide the circle into each-sized wedges, with each wedge representing a frame in your animation. To divide the circle into 8 wedges, each piece should be 45 degrees. For 9 wedges, 40 degrees, 10 wedges, 36 degrees, 11 wedges, 33 degrees, and 12 wedges, 30 degrees. Step 5. Cut out the whole circle. Step 6. Cut small rectangular slots about an 1/8 inch wide by 1 inch long along the separating lines of each wedge. Start at the very outside of the circle and cut inward. Step 7. Poke a small hole through the center of the wheel or slightly widen the one that is already there. Step 8. Repeat steps 2 through 5 on the drawing paper, but make this circle 2 inches smaller in diameter. Step 9. On the drawing paper circle, create your animation step by step, clockwise around the circle. This is your animation wheel. Step 10. With small dabs of rubber cement on the back, align the animation wheel so that it is centered on the thick paper wheel. Allow 10 minutes for the rubber cement to dry. The smaller wheel should come about to the slot you cut in step 7. Step 11. Poke the thumbtack through the animation wheel and the hole you created in the heavy paper. Step 12. Push the thumbtack into the side of the pencil eraser. It should be in firmly enough to stick, but still loose enough for you to be able to spin the wheel freely. Step 13. Face the pointed away from you. Step 14. Gently spin the phenakistoscope while looking through the slits. The animation will appear in the mirror. Did you know the phenakistoscope was invented in 1832 by the Belgian physicist Joseph Plateau?
Okay, so that'll be in your Blackboard if you want to go and make one. But I just think it's helpful to see how it's made, and it's sort of the best like way to see how it works when it's done. So that was like an early entertainment toy that folks would use and make. And again, some of them would end up being mass produced, but like and that one existed like well before photography too. It just was sort of a predecessor to movies. Sorry, I don't know where my brain went there. But here, some of these are supposed to be GIFs, but for whatever reason, when I share them, they don't often work as GIFs. So these are just some old phenakistoscope discs to reference. After the phenakistoscope comes what is called the zoetrope, and some people say zoetrope, but I think zoetrope is the correct pronunciation. This one, as you can see from the image here, is actually a cylinder that has slits all around the outside. And then you place the little strips inside at the bottom, and when you spin it, you can see the animation through those slits. Sorry, I'm seeing what I have. Here's an example of a really old one. This, again, ends up being something similar to when you have the camera obscura being projected from the ceiling so that a whole bunch of folks can stand around it. That was sort of the goal with the zoetrope too. The phenakistoscope is like a one-person, one-on-one viewing thing, but the zoetrope, you could have a couple people, probably not too many because it was pretty small, but a couple people standing around and looking in to see the animation inside. And you see next to this one, there's some little animation strips. The one on the outside is this dog kind of jumping and playing with a ball. So all kinds of different animations there. Here, this one, this one has the video. So let's take a look at the video about the zoetrope. A lot of videos for these, mostly because, you know, when you're talking about moving things, you have to see them moving and not just in still. So let me get to the zoetrope one. And this is like a contemporary, more modern one that you could probably still buy today.
After nearly 200 years, the zoetrope is back. Better than ever. The beautiful device takes these cartoon strips and turns them into mesmerizing animations. Simply place inside and spin. To see them come to life right before your eyes. Different animations and downloadable templates to draw your own will keep you and your friends and family entertained for hours. Plus, with a light-up lid, the effect is even more amazing in the dark. Like a glowing tornado of animation. Handcrafted in the USA with attention to detail. Built using eco-friendly faux leather. Real brass tacks. And solid hardwood laminate. Beautifully packaged, shipped worldwide, and available online at zoeflix.com. Buy yours today.
I'm not trying to sell the zoetrope to you. I just wanted to show you how it worked, and I thought that one was pretty cute. So that's how that one works. Again, like you said, hours and hours of entertainment for you and your family. So that's also something that you could probably make out of like an oatmeal container or something. So if you're feeling spicy, you could take that on. Again, this one's supposed to be a GIF, but the GIFs don't work in the blackboard. So imagine this spinning and this man kind of taking his skin off. I don't know why that's a thing. But anyways, after the zoetrope comes the praxinoscope. And so on the left, you see the zoetrope with the slits. On the right, you see the praxinoscope with the mirrors. And the mirrors are actually on the inside cylinder, and the strip still goes on the outside. It's very similar in the sense, see, like the strips still go out here, and then you spin it, but you watch in the mirrors. So this one would actually be very well suited for a larger group of folks to be watching the animations all at once. And then I have, again, a video that shows you how this one works, and I think this one's super basic. I really wish it was faster to get to this share screen here, but thank you for your patience while I do so. So here you go. And there's like no voiceover on this one, so it's really just showing you, like, if you're standing from one perspective staring at one of the mirrors, you'll see that animation go. And so again, like very much like the stereoscope, this was like a huge deal because you didn't see images move. They were, if it was a painting, it was still. If it was a photograph, it was still. So this was always like groundbreaking stuff here. I think you kind of get this just keeps going like this. So I think you get the gist of it. But again, it's just nice to see how those things work, especially like when someone's got the real deal and they can share a video of it. So let me get back to our slides. Okay. So I forgot. I have another video. Oh my gosh. Bear with me, guys. Okay. This video here, this one gives a short history and details about the phenakistoscope, the zoetrope, and the praxinoscope. And then after that, we'll move on to the last one, the zoopraxiscope. But this will give us a good history and visuals to go along with it, like moving pictures.
Inspired by Faraday's wheel, Joseph Plateau in Brussels and Simon Stampfer in Vienna invent the phenakistoscope independently of one another in 1832. Stampfer called it the stroboscope. In England, it was known as the phantoscope. This disc demonstrates continuous movement for the first time. Comparable to film because it uses minimal differences between the images to create the illusion of movement. In 1833, Horner invented the Daedalus, later called the zoetrope or wheel of life. Here, the phases of movement are also seen in the form of an infinite loop through the slits. We see an image, then no image, and then a slightly different second image, producing the illusion of movement in the mind of the viewer. In 1877, Emile Reynaud built his praxinoscope. We see the images in the mirrors. position of the dark phase between the slits is taken over by the angle at which the mirrors are set up.
So that's kind of the summary of the three different tools that we have looked at so far, moving image tools, and then we have the next one, which is called the zoopraxiscope. And this is one, like after all these other ones have been around for quite some time, because literally none of them had any reliance on photography. So those have been around, for many, many years, even before photography. What wasn't around was the zoopraxiscope, and Muybridge was experimenting with this. The zoopraxiscope, as you can kind of see in this engraving here, added the magic lantern's ability to project an image onto the wall to the zoetrope or the praxinoscope's ability to portray those simulations of movement. So we have, well, here's another one. This one's actually showing Muybridge's horse here, but I have a video that kind of shows you how this one works, which is actually pretty great. So let me get to it again. Like I said, lots of videos for this one just because of the nature of the material. Okay, so this one's going to be all about Muybridge's zoopraxiscope.
Edward Muybridge was a landscape, urban, and travel photographer. He was commissioned by Leland Stanford, an entrepreneur and horse breeder, to devise ways of using the camera to analyze the movement of horses scientifically. In 1878, Muybridge published his first series of sequence photographs taken at Stanford's Palo Alto farm in California. Muybridge shot many sequences of animals and humans using his innovative motion photography process. He became well known for his work, but the movement portrayed was so new to his audience that not everybody believed his pictures were true. To help demonstrate his photographic findings during his lectures, Muybridge invented the zoopraxiscope. This projected his images in sequence and gave them the illusion of movement. However, to prepare the photographs for projection, Muybridge needed to transfer them to a glass disc, and this was no easy process because the projector had a limitation. If Muybridge used it to project the images onto the screen without treating them first, the image would look squashed up and distorted. Muybridge had to counter this effect by re-photographing them at an angle to make them appear wider, and bending the photographs in the opposite direction to the distortion caused by the circular disc. The re-photographed prints were laid out in a circle to create a paper guide disc. A specialist artist then copied the images painstakingly onto a 16-inch glass disc using paint. The zoopraxiscope discs were a great success, helping Muybridge prove the accuracy of his photography and leading to a contract at the University of Pennsylvania where he took many thousands of sequence photographs. As time went on, more detail went into the projected images, often with several different sequences on the same disc. This process of combining figures would not have been possible had the original photographs been used, and gave Muybridge great freedom in creating imaginative scenes with many moving figures. For his appearance at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, which showcased many new inventions and popular trends, Muybridge also created new discs in color. These were made in a similar way up to a point. But when the photographic montage was complete on paper, the process changed. Instead of copying it directly onto glass, the artist made a paper drawing of the sequence. This was signed by Muybridge and photographed. A large glass negative was produced, and then a large glass positive, which the artist, Erwin Faber, would enrich with vivid color, and the finished disc was cut out of the glass sheet, ready for projection. It was the silhouette discs that were used for most of Muybridge's lectures, even though the later discs were more colorful. But with the emergence of cinema, these discs remained almost unknown, signaling the end of Muybridge's extraordinary experiments with making images move. Nonetheless, they are truly beautiful objects to see in motion today.
So that's kind of great because you don't ever get to see that anywhere. So to see it like there in that video, that's like kind of really, you also, like, if you go to a museum or something, there's not really many of those discs around, so it's really unlikely that you'll ever see one in real life. So to have that sort of ability to see at least the general idea of what was happening with the zoopraxiscope at that time is really kind of a cool thing. Finally, for today, we have the kinetoscope. So after Thomas Edison had seen Muybridge's zoopraxiscope, he began to experiment with making images move as well. And his kinetoscope, which he introduced to the public in 1894, made images move in this box structure, and there was a viewing device on top. So it was more commonly referred to as a peep show, but it used, you can kind of see it in the box there. There's like, 50 feet of flexible film, which was a new thing. So it wasn't perfect, but it worked for what they were trying to do here. And the viewer would be illuminated like behind a magnifying glass so that they could see all the images in there. And that was about, usually you put like a nickel in and you got to see 13 seconds of a moving image. So I have 2 videos left. So one that's specifically about the kinetoscope, and then one that's this museum that this guy has with all these sort of reproductions and originals of kind of all these different moving image devices. That's kind of cool. So the last slide is just sort of the inner workings of the kinetoscope. So if you really wanted to kind of dig into like seeing the technical aspects and the schematics of how it works, that's all here for you. But really what we have left to talk about today is just in the 2 videos. So let me get back to video, and then we can sum up the day, or finish the day rather. Okay, so here's the kinetoscope.
Further inspiration had been found during a visit to Paris in 1889, where Edison had met French scientist Etienne Jules Marey, whose chronophotography captured 12 consecutive images per second on a long, continuous piece of film.
Marey had been filming birds by converting a gun into a camera, so that as he pulled the trigger, he was actually taking rapid pictures of them with strip film. And this influenced Edison to go back and experiment with roll film.
Motion picture technology is difficult. You have film that stops, gets the image, advances, stops, gets the next image, and it has to sensitive enough to do it. Edison worked with George Eastman to develop the film with the sprocket holes, figuring out how the machinery is going to advance the film, stop it, advance the film, stop it. And he developed a really terrific camera. And that was his contribution.
Throughout, Edison had worked closely with his assistant in the mining operation, a sometime photographer named William Dixon, who was largely responsible for the optics of the device. Now, Dixon had begun to produce the first films in what eventually would be the Edison Company's extensive catalog, a collection of short features meant to be shown one at a time on a coin-operated peephole viewing cabinet called a kinetoscope.
The first motion picture entertainment device was an ingenious contraption that allowed you to see a loop of film, a very short loop.
The inaugural batch of kinetoscopes shipped from West Orange in April 1894. 5 to Atlantic City, 10 to Chicago, and 10 to a small storefront in Manhattan, a former shoe shop near Herald Square, soon to become the world's first commercial kinetoscope parlor.
They were setting up the machines, getting ready to open, and curiosity seekers had gathered, and they decided to let them in to give the machines a try. And it turned out to overwhelm them. The public poured in. The novelty of the thing was incredibly attractive.
So that gives you a good idea of the kinetoscope. And then we have the final video here that I think, am I talking about the right? Yeah, this is the right one. Sorry. I was like, this doesn't look familiar, but it's just the middle of the video. So this is the guy that has like the little museum of moving images here, which is kind of great to see his collection.
This is a reproduction that I built because they're very, very rare. There's like about 5 original kinetoscopes left in the whole world. They were only out for a short time. This was the first machine that used 35mm film. Edison set the 35mm standard for film for this machine, not for projectors. Projectors came later. So this is a sort of a replica. It's a pretty good replica. The mechanism inside is a replica. There's a person in America who's an expert on these who helped me with the castings and the bits and pieces for it. But I had made a lot of the other parts myself. And the film in there also is a copy of an 1897 kinetoscope film as well. I think her name's Annabelle. It's called the Butterfly Dance.
The zoetrope was invented by William Horner. It was the first of several optical toys that demonstrated the persistence of vision, establishing the illusion of movement, and allowed several people to view it at the same time.
The brain is tricked into believing the several spinning images are moving by deceiving the eye to give the appearance of one continuous movement.
Okay. So again, just some repetitive stuff, but it's nice to see how that all works out there. So you can see how they were using these early toys to kind of trick your eye into seeing things that you otherwise couldn't see. So again, with photography, we were now able, like we were getting to a point with the movement photography that you could capture things very rapidly in the way that Muybridge was doing. You could capture things with very extended exposures to see the trace of movement, like the futurist photographers and their photodynamism. And then, of course, they're moving toward movies and actual motion pictures through all of these different moving image tools that we just looked at here. So obviously, like we're doing our class on the history of photography, so we won't be going any further into moving images, but you know, if that's something of interest to you, there are separate classes about the history of film. And I don't know where they start the history of film in those classes, but you can reach out to those faculty for information on that. And that will do it for today. So thank you again for joining me, and I will see you next time.